I thought our life was steady. Coffee in the morning, quiet shows at night, the comfort of her breath beside me until I found a box in the attic tied with blue thread. Letters in her hand, written to me as if I were gone. Each page unraveled what I thought I knew, until I could no longer tell if I was living my marriage or only reading it. I used to believe marriage was simple, and I wore that belief like an old varsity jacket that still fit across the shoulders even if the sleeves felt tight on humid days, and every morning began the same with the clatter of the grinder and the slow pour, and the way she would bump my hip with hers to reach the sugar while our dog surveyed the kitchen like a sleepy sheriff, and the news mumbled along and the clock above the sink tooted us toward work, and later we would sit with the soft blue glow of a familiar show, and then the lights would go off and I would listen to the breath beside me and think that permanence sounded like this, steady and unhurried and kind. The attic was the least permanent place in our house because nothing up there stayed where it belonged, and it held summer heat like an angry stove and winter cold like a meat locker, and I avoided it unless a bulb burned out or a leak demanded a bucket or a bin needed shifting before it split. That afternoon I went up with a broom and the intention to tame a drift of insulation that raccoons had torn through last spring, and the boards creaked under my feet like a chorus of old men, and the light made a trapezoid on the dust, and every box along the joists wore a label in her careful block letters that always reminded me of the first forms we filled out after our wedding when her name looked borrowed and she practiced it in the margins. Behind the blotchy fiberglass I found a box with no label and no tape, and I told myself it was probably tax stuff or a gadget I had sworn to return and never did, yet my hands hesitated because the air around it felt colder than the rest, as if an old window had opened inside the lid, and I made a joke to no one about haunted warranties and then I slid it free. Inside lay a stack of letters bound with blue thread, and the paper smelled like a drawer in a farmhouse kitchen, and on the top page I saw her handwriting clear as a street sign and the words "to my husband," and my first thought rose fast and ugly and spoke of betrayal, because no one writes to a spouse under the same roof unless there is something to hide, and I felt the roof settle lower like a heavy hand on my head. The first letter was not long, and it began with a confession about a night that happened while she was away for a conference, and it told of a hotel bar and a weakness that grew in the dim, and I had to sit on the plywood because my legs forgot their purpose, and I read the next one and the next until the ink began to waver from the sweat along my palms, and every page followed the same path from apology to self-interrogation to a plea for time, and they were all addressed to me as if I had died and would be reading from beyond, or as if I had gone silent and could only be reached by ink. I laid them across the rafters to see the arc of the thing, and the dates made a strange constellation because they drifted across months where I knew exactly where she had been and with whom, and the places named in the margins were unfamiliar to me like towns on a map from another decade, and yet each letter carried details I recognized from our kitchen or our hallway or the way I leave my shoes pointed toward the door, which meant the writer was the woman I lived with and the woman who laughed at the same parts of the same old movies. I kept telling myself I had uncovered her affair, and that my job now was simple and brutal and involved lawyers and boxes and the immediate division of spoons, yet the certainty did not take because the letters did not breathe like evidence, they breathed like drafts, and none bore a stamp, smudge, or fold that suggested a journey through any post office, and every envelope was tucked under another like a secret rehearsal for a speech that had never been delivered. When I laid the top letter down and looked back at the first, I noticed a line in the corner that I had ignored in my bright righteous panic, and it said that if I ever read this then I found it too soon, and that is when the attic tilted and the steady life I had praised with my morning coffee slid toward the eaves. I sat longer than I meant to with the thread in my hand and the dust in my throat, and I listened to the hum of the house and the faint tremor of water in the pipes, and I thought about permanence and about how much of it relies on never opening the wrong box, and how all safety is a story we keep telling each other as we take out the trash and argue about the thermostat and kiss at night because that is the script we know. I put the letters back with the care you give a sleeping child, and I set the lid in place, and I told myself I would walk down those ladder steps and make a sandwich and say nothing and study her face across the table for the hairline crack that the day would have to reveal now that I had seen behind the drywall of our marriage. Instead, I stood at the lip of the attic with my hand on the hatch, and I thought about the words to my husband inked by my wife, and I understood that a quiet life only looks quiet from the street, and that sometimes an ordinary roof hides a slow storm that has been writing its own weather for years. I came down the ladder with the careful steps of a man who carries a sleeping child, and each rung felt farther apart than I remembered, and when the hatch closed above me the hallway light looked strange, as if the bulb had changed itself while I was gone, and I stood there with my hand on the string for a full beat because I wanted to see if the house would react to my discovery like a living thing that has been caught in a lie. The dog looked up from his post on the rug and thumped his tail and went back to the sort of nap that has nothing to prove, and I envied him with a deep and stupid pride because he believed in us without terms and without letters. I told myself to be ordinary, and I made a late lunch that tasted like cardboard wisdom, and I put the plate in the sink, and I wiped the counter twice, and I opened a drawer and closed it and opened it again like a man trying to remember the secret knock of his own club. I checked the calendar on the fridge, and I traced with my finger the trips that stood in neat little squares, and I whispered the names of airports like a spell that might hold back whatever I had seen above the ceiling, and the dates in those letters did not settle against the dates on the magnets, and I felt the first clean snap of doubt about my own memory. She came home with a grocery bag and a breeze, and she set down oranges and a bunch of cilantro that looked like a small triumphant forest, and she kissed me on the cheek and said that the checkout line had been a circus, and I nodded, and I filed that detail in the new cabinet of suspicion, and I hated that a normal complaint could slide so easily into evidence once you start building your case with feelings instead of facts. We cooked together with the simple choreography we had crafted across years, and she chopped and I stirred, and the dog played border patrol between our feet, and her knife flashed the way it always did, and I watched her face while pretending to watch the pot, and I wanted to find even a wobble in her smile and found none, and that clean surface terrified me more than a confession ever could. We ate and talked about a neighbor who thought raccoons were a local militia, and about the way the thermostat never displays the truth, and I laughed at the right places and heard my own voice ring like a coin dropped on tile, and I wondered if that sound had always been there and I had simply not listened. After the dishes, I told her I would bring down the winter blanket because the nights had cooled, and she thanked me and called after me to mind the attic step that likes to pretend it is brave, and I said I would, and I climbed again into the hot breath of the eaves with a flashlight and a new reverence for cardboard. The box waited exactly where I had left it, and the blue thread lay snug around the stack, and the dust on the lid bore the crescent print of my hand, and I lifted the letters and I counted them against the count that my nerves had made earlier, and the number felt off by one, and I did not trust that feeling yet. I let it guide me as a man lets a creek guide his walk in a forest where he is not sure of the path. I slid the thread loose and found a new letter at the back that wore today as its date, and my stomach folded like a bad chair because I had been with her since she came home, and the hatch had not moved, and the dog would have raised an alarm for any mouse bold enough to consider paper. The handwriting matched her careful hand, and the salutation met me the same way, and the content read like a line written straight across the distance between two chairs in the same room, because she wrote that if I had found the stack then I had also found it too early, and that I should wait for the rest to make sense, and that we were more complicated than our best days ever confessed, and that she was sorry for using silence as if it were kind. I held that new page and felt a current run from my fingers to my shoulder like a wire that had been cut and spliced, and I looked over my own shoulder as if the beams might be listening, and I slipped that page into my pocket because I wanted some part of this mystery to be mine alone for a breath before it consumed everything else, and I tied the thread back and I put the lid back and I carried down the winter blanket and the air of a man who has done nothing more exciting than shoe a spider. She was folding laundry in the bedroom with the easy rhythm of someone who has made peace with the perpetual nature of socks, and she told me to tuck the blanket at the foot, and I did, and she asked what I wanted to watch, and I said something dumb that I knew we would both tolerate, and I watched the light of the screen paint her face, and I studied the lines near her eyes that showed up when she smiled, and I tried to decide whether those lines had deepened because of me or because of the invisible man in the letters, and I felt a hard honesty about my own part in the slow weather of our house. When the night settled, she drifted into sleep with the fast collapse of a person who spends her energy like cash, and I lay flat and counted ceiling shadows, and the dog chased dream rabbits with his paws, and the heater kicked in with a shudder that always sounds like doubt clearing its throat, and I reached into my pocket and ran my thumb along the new page, and I told myself that evidence would solve this and that emotion would only turn the water to fog. I took my phone and I walked to the hallway and I checked photos from the months that the letters named, and I found our faces in dinners and weddings and in airport seats, and I tried to match those days to her confessions, and it was like holding a map next to a mirror because both were true and both refused to merge. I sat on the stairs until the numbers on the oven clock ticked past a crooked hour, and then I went back to bed and I slept in small pieces that tasted like dust. Morning came with the ruthless cheer of sunlight on a day that never did anything wrong to you yet, and she made coffee and said that the milk was on its last legs, and I quipped that the milk needed therapy, and we both laughed because that is what our marriage does with little problems, and I wondered if we had done that with big problems too, and maybe even with giant ones that brought their own weather. I took the letter from my pocket and slipped it behind a row of books in my office, and I pulled a legal pad and began to write her name the way she writes it, and then my name the way I do, and then a sentence that I remember from a grocery list she wrote the week before, and I hunted for inconsistencies like a cop who believes that truth can be trapped with lines and loops, and it all matched with a boring perfection that felt like a bad punchline. I took a breath and wrote my own confession as a test, and I held my hand steady, and I tried to copy her tilt, and I could not, and I felt relief at the failure because it meant the world still had corners that resisted me. At lunch we met at a diner we liked for its devotion to pie, and she ordered what she always ordered and I did too, and the waitress called us honey and dear, as if we were a pair of letters that had finally reached the right mailbox, and I slid a casual question onto the table about a town from one of the pages, and I said that I had read an article about the best places to retire and that this town had come up and did she know it, and she smiled and said that she had driven through it once on a college road trip and that it had a billboard with a cow that winked, and I smiled back and the detail landed with the crisp sound of truth, even though I had never stood beside a winking cow and I felt the ground under our booth tilt just a degree. Back home I opened the attic again in the late afternoon because compulsion wears the same jacket as caution, and I wanted to see if the stack had bred another page while we ate pie, and I found no new letter, and I felt a disappointment that I could not justify to any man I respect, and I sat with that feeling until it turned into a plan, because I have always been a man who moves from confusion to structure like a mason stacking bricks. Until he makes a wall or a door. I took a notebook and I recorded the dates and the towns and the phrases that repeated like small bells, and I drew a timeline that bent like a river, and I marked the day I found the box as a new fork where all channels meet, and I promised myself that I would confront her if the map demanded it and not before, and that I would not confess my snooping until I could put a reason on the table that did not sound like pure fear. That night I slid the attic hatch one more time and placed a small strip of painter tape across the edge, a trick I learned from a neighbor who suspects teenagers of sneaking into his pool, and I pressed my thumb into the tape to make the print that would tell me whether a ghost climbs ladders in our house, and I went to bed and held still, and I listened for steps and heard only the soft choreography of shared sleep and the faint ticking of our reliable clock. And I thought about permanence again. And I wondered whether permanence is just choreography done without thought, and whether stories start the second you decide to look at the steps. Morning found the tape exactly where I left it, and the faint oval of my thumb sat in the soft blue like a sleepy moon, and there was no rip and no curl and no sign that any living thing had pressed that hatch from the other side, and I stood under it with the kind of hollow triumph you feel after you count the money in your wallet and discover that yes, you are still broke, yet at least the math agrees with you. I made coffee and watched the steam lift like a little parade, and I told myself that the day would behave if I did, and that whatever lives in a box in an attic can be contained by daylight and by lists and by the slow, clean march of chores. She left early for a meeting and kissed me near the ear and told me to water the basil before it sulked itself to death, and the dog approved the plan with a yawn, and I leaned a chair beneath the hatch because I hated the way it stared down as if it were a mouth waiting for me to climb in. I lasted until 10 before the chair felt like a dare, and I pulled it aside and I climbed, and the tape still held, and I peeled it up with the care of a man lifting a bandage, and I set it on the shelf by the light bulb box, and I eased the hatch up like a lid on soup you suspect may bite, and I breathed the familiar attic air that smells like history and mice and last summer, and I crawled across the beams to the box, and I found the thread tied in a knot that I swear I had not tied, which is exactly the kind of sentence that will get you dismissed by practical men, and yet there it lies. I picked the knot and lifted the first page and found a new letter on top, and the date wore the morning on it, and the first line mentioned the way I overwater the basil when I feel guilty, and the second line thanked me for being gentle with the tape, and the third line said I would lift the hatch at 10 because patience has never liked the way I hold it, and the attic seemed to inhale when I read that habit written down, and I said out loud that this was not funny, which is what a man says when he stands at the exact point where fear and wonder meet, and he hopes that one will back away out of respect. I read on and found no reference to a stranger in a bar or a secret room or any romance beyond the old awkward romance of two people who have shared cabinets and blankets for years, and the letter said that the other letters were true and also not true, and that truth acts like water in an old house because it will find a seam and it will widen it with patience, and it will carve a path that looks simple only after it has finished the work. There was a line about how we both forget the same birthdays even when we set reminders, and how forgetting together is the closest thing we have to a hobby, and I laughed a little because the sting of recognition makes sound even in an attic. The practical man inside me kicked his way to the front, and he brought a plan with him, and it involved moving the box because control looks like movement when you have no idea what else to do, and I carried the box down with the respect I normally give to cake, and I placed it in my office, and I locked the door, and I opened the lower drawer of my file cabinet and slid the stack beneath a folder of warranties that could bore the devil, and I shut the drawer, and I tested the key, and I told myself that if another page appeared in there, then I had either married a magician or sleepwalked like a dedicated intern. I set up a second test because redundancy brings comfort to cowards and to engineers, and I sprinkled a whisper of flour across the threshold of the office because my mother swore by old tricks and I wanted her voice in the room, even if only in the shape of talc. I ate lunch at the sink like a teenager, and I watered the basil with measured mercy, and I stood in the yard with the dog and watched a hawk circle with the calm of a judge who has seen this particular case 1,000 times, and I wondered if the hawk reads the same sky each day or if its map shifts like mine. At 2 I checked the office and the flower lay undisturbed like a tiny field after the first frost, and the lock turned with a faithful click, and the drawer opened to reveal the stack, and on top of the stack sat a new page that did not exist that morning, and the word to my husband sang from the first line like a bell that only I could hear, and the rest of the page described the hawk and the way I tilt my head when I watch anything that refuses to be owned. And I held the paper by the edge as if it might burn me, and I admired the neat slope of her letters, and I admired the cruel patience of whatever force was beating me at my own simple game. I am not a man who goes easily to mystical answers because I work with things that can be turned off and on and fixed with a new seal or a patient hand, and yet the room felt crowded by the part of the world that insists on moving without being seen, and I hated it, and I also felt the kind of relief you get when a problem finally admits it will not be solved by a wrench. I went for a drive because motion scrubs the mind, and I steered past the library and the church and the hardware store that sells the same tape I had peeled that morning, and I thought about the towns named in the earlier letters, and I picked one and pointed the car toward it because if the script wants a setting then I will see it with my own eyes and maybe the view will grant me jurisdiction. The town sat an hour away, and it wore a railroad and a tired diner and a mural of fruit that looked proud and a billboard where a cow winked like an accomplice, and the sight hit me with a small honest shock because I had half believed that the cow existed only as a convenient detail in a tidy lie, and there it stood with a smug tilt and a sun-faded grin. I parked and walked the length of downtown with my hands in my pockets like a man shopping for a version of himself that fits better, and I checked my phone for photos from this place and found none, and still I felt a low current of familiarity that had no map, and I sat in the diner and ordered coffee and a slice of a pie the server called famous, and I asked about the mural and the billboard, and the cow winked again through the window as if it were in on the bit. I paid and left, and I took a side street and found a motel with an empty pool and a sign that said Color TV as if that were still an advantage, and I put my palm on the office door and the wood felt warm and the warmth moved up my arm like recognition, and I took my hand back because I am not a man who collapses into coincidence without a seatbelt. At home I found the house in the soft light that makes every room believe in its own cleanliness, and I stood in the doorway and said her name, and she answered from the kitchen with a normal hello that made me feel both anchored and accused because the world should not sound normal when your office drawer performs magic tricks. She stirred a pot and asked if I remembered to bring in the mail, and I said yes and no at the same time and chose yes to remain loyal to the version of me that keeps small promises, and she told me that her meeting had been the usual, and I nodded and set my keys down, and the dog pressed his head to my leg, and I felt grateful for a creature that trusts touch over narrative. I wanted to ask her how the letters travel, and I wanted to ask her why the cow knows me, and I wanted to ask her whether she believes in the idea that a life can be written by someone who is not inside it, and instead I asked whether we had any lemon because the soup looked like it could use brightness, and she handed me half a lemon as if we were the world champions of the sport. That night I wrote my own letter because the experiment wanted symmetry, and also because I needed to speak without the risk of my voice turning our kitchen into a courtroom, and I wrote to my wife with my crooked block letters, and I told her that I had found the box and that I had not meant to find it, and that I did not know whether the confessions were history or prophecy, and that I am not a man who scares easy, though I reserve the right to adjust that belief when paper predicts my day. I folded the page and slid it into an envelope and addressed it to my wife with the same neat gravity that I use on tax forms, and I did not hide it in the attic, and I did not hide it in the office, and I tucked it into the pocket of the jacket I wear when I need a second version of myself, and I went to bed with the jacket on the chair, and I slept like a tourist in my own house. I woke before dawn because I wanted to catch the world before it decided who it would be today, and I reached for the jacket, and the pocket felt light, and the envelope was gone, and I looked under the chair and beneath the bed and in the wastebasket because men always check the wrong places first, and then I walked to the office, and the flower I had swept away yesterday glittered in a thin stubborn line, and the lock turned and the drawer opened and my envelope sat on top of the stack with a fresh page beneath it, and the fresh page began with "to my husband" and went on to thank me for the lemon, and then it told me that I would go to the town with the mural and the winking cow, and that the pie at the diner would be better than I expected and worse than I would remember, and that my letter belonged with the others because stories breed best in dark boxes. I stood there and felt the house tilt again, only I was steadier now because you cannot live on a ship and be surprised by every wave, and I slid my envelope beneath the stack as if I were feeding a patient animal, and I put the new page aside and I read the ones that came before because I wanted to see if they looked different now, and they did, because once a box takes your letter it becomes a place you live and not just a place you visit. I spent the afternoon repairing a door that sticks because I wanted some part of this day to obey me, and the wood gave way to my plan with the relief of a problem that wanted solving, and the hinge sat true and the latch met its home, and I closed the door and opened it again until the click sounded like a held breath finally delivered, and I took that sound as a small win, and I pocketed it for later when the bigger storm would ask for proof that I had any skill beyond worry. I made dinner and she read on the couch and the dog snored like a tiny engine, and I looked at both of them and felt the ache and the gratitude that arrive together when you realize that the ordinary contains more moving parts than any miracle, and I told myself that I would not speak until I could hold the conversation like a level in my hands and keep the bubble centered. When we went to bed, I listened to the wind drag a branch across the roof like a slow pen, and I thought about authors and characters and who gets to choose the verbs, and I promised myself I would not let an invisible hand pick mine for me. I woke into a day that looked clean on the surface, the way a pond looks clean until you step in and feel weeds around your ankles, and I decided that ceremony might tame chaos, so I wrote 3 rules on a sticky note and stuck it to the coffee maker, and the rules were simple and earnest and doomed, which is my preferred format for rules, and they said do not open the drawer, do not open the hatch, do not start any fires, and the dog approved because rules mean treats in his worldview, and I fed him as a reward for his agreement, and for a minute I felt like the adult in the room, which is a sensation that comes and goes like cell service in the hills. I went to work and fixed a thermostat that lied by 2 degrees and a door closer that preferred drama over closure, and each small repair gave me a moral I could pocket because the world still offers problems that yield to a hinge and a hex key and a steady hand, and I held those wins like talismans against a box that eats letters and a town where cows conspire with billboards. By late afternoon, I had rehearsed my opening line for the kind of conversation that puts marriages through metal detectors, and I drove home with that line in my mouth, ready to present it without shaking and without heat, because I respect heat, but I have learned to keep it for grilling. She was at the table with her laptop and one leg tucked under like a kid doing homework, and she looked up and smiled, and the part of me that takes accurate notes wrote down that the smile looked real. And then I told her about the attic and the blue thread and the dates that did not nest inside the calendar and the new pages that arrive like well-mannered trespassers, and I spoke slowly the way you speak when you carry a tray of water through a crowded room, and I watched her face as I laid each fact on the table between us. She did not deny, and she did not cry, and she did not perform the frantic apology that movies have trained us to expect, and instead she exhaled like a runner who sees the finish banner, and she told me that I was not supposed to find them yet, and the words landed with the soft thud of something inevitable, and I had the spare thought that this is how you know a line has been rehearsed, because it fits the moment too well. I asked how long she had known, and she said long enough to build a routine with it, and she stood and asked me to follow, and she led me past the hallway where the tape mark had been and into the bedroom, and she knelt by the tall dresser and slid it forward with a grunt that sounded like a vow, and behind it sat another box, the twin of mine but tied with red thread, that looked festive and threatening in the same breath, and she said there is something you need to see, and she gave me the box like a nurse hands over a newborn, and my hands took it because hands do their jobs even when brains request a pause. I set it on the bed and felt the mattress dip as if the box carried lead, and I lifted the lid and found letters in my handwriting, and my stomach tilted like an old boat, and the room shrank to include only the bed and the box and the proof that I am apparently a more prolific writer than I previously believed. The first envelope carried a name I did not know, and the salutation used the kind of shorthand that happens when 2 people have built small bridges over annoying details, and my own block letters leaned exactly where I lean, and my odd habit of crossing a T long after I have finished the word appeared on the second line like a signature within a signature, and the mistake I always make with the word separate showed up with a smug little grin, and I ran my finger along the loops as if they might confess under pressure, and they did not, and I read a page and it felt like memory, only it did not belong to me, and the page described a conversation about ceramic birds on a thrift store shelf and how we laughed because one bird had a cracked beak and looked stubborn and another looked superior, and the memory pressed a thumb against something in my head that rang back like a jar, and I did not know whether the resonance meant I was recognizing life or absorbing somebody else's. I told her that I did not write these, and she nodded as if we had finally reached the first honest fact in days, and she said that she believed me, and that belief soothed and stung at the same time because belief implies the possibility of doubt, and I am a man who likes a closed circuit. We sat on the bed and held the pages like 2 volunteers sorting flyers after a parade, and she told me that these letters appeared the same way, and that she found the first 2 years ago behind the laundry room panel when a repairman had left a gap, and that she moved them to this spot because hiding places like company, and she wanted the boxes to keep each other from getting lonely, and I told her that I appreciated the humane approach to stationery, and she smiled because our marriage knows how to laugh even while the boat takes on water. She said that she had read them, and that she had hated them, and then later loved them, and that they made her feel watched and also understood, and that most days she was not sure whether the author meant kindness or science, and I nodded because I was having the same argument in my own head with worse grammar. The logical approach stood up and tried to run into the fire the way logic does when it refuses to accept that a blaze exists, and I proposed that someone had practiced my hand and that perhaps the letters had been created by a bored cousin or a clever kid in a class that teaches forgery for scholarships, and she pointed out the details that nobody sees unless they live with me, like the way I always indent the first line and then forget to indent any other, and the way I draw a small rectangle When I cannot decide between two words and I knew she was right and that knowledge did not make me a believer but it did make me a more careful skeptic. I said we should burn both boxes because fire is the oldest tool and because I wanted to choose a verb that did not come from the letters, and she shook her head and she did not plead. She simply said that the letters do not like fire, which should be a ridiculous sentence, and yet it fit this room like another piece of furniture. I said that everything does not like fire and she said that I understood her and I did, which was annoying. I carried my box from the office and set it beside hers on the bed like two guests who refused to talk to each other, and we took out pages and matched dates, and the chronology behaved like a braided river where two channels drift apart and bump back together and sometimes trade sandbars while the current pretends to be casual, and the place names made a geography of our life that was true and untrue at once because the letters knew our streets and our schedules and also new streets that I had never turned down and schedules that would have required a second life tucked into the first. On the bottom of my stack I found a fresh page that I had not seen, and it predicted the rules I wrote that morning and the useless bravery of the sticky note, and it described the exact number of steps from the driveway to the kitchen when you hurry and try to look calm, and I could almost hear my stride counted and tallied by a patient accountant, and I folded the page shut because the polite violence of accuracy tired me more than any argument would. We took a walk because air helps, and our neighborhood applied its usual spells with maple shade and the cilantro breath from the taco truck and the sound of a kid practicing a trumpet with the relentless courage of the very young, and we walked side by side like allies searching for a border, and I told her the part one had not said that the first letters had read like a confession about a hotel bar, and that I had felt the old metal weight of jealousy in my pocket, and she told me the part she had not said that the first letters in my hand had read like devotion and had made her furious and vain in the same moment because I wrote to another woman with tenderness that I had not shown at home in months, and there in the street with the trumpet wailing we stood in the neat geometry of two people who love each other and also hate what they think the other might be capable of, and then we started walking again because stillness invites melodrama and we have a strict policy against that. Back home we set the boxes on the kitchen table because the table knows our best and our worst, and we wanted a witness with a good memory, and I made tea like a man hoping that boiling water could resolve an argument with physics, and she took a lemon from the bowl and cut it in near silence, and we returned to the pages with the steadiness of people who build sheds together on weekends. Near the center of her stack we found a page that matched a night I remember for its plain sweetness, a night of pasta and laundry, and a small storm that kept the house company, and the page admitted to guilt and to fear and to waiting for me to read and to decide, and I looked at her and told her that if she had handed me that page that night I would have held it, and her and I would have hated it and worked with it, and we would have slouched forward together. And she believed me because when you live with someone long enough you know the difference between performance and work. I picked up one of the letters in my supposed hand addressed to the unknown woman, and I noticed a detail that shook me in a new way because the letter included a line about a small scar under my left thumb, and the story of the scar matched the story I tell when anyone asks, and it also included a different story about a second scar I do not carry, and that contradiction walked me right up to the edge of an idea and then refused to push me over, and the idea was that the writer knows me and does not know me, which is a sentence a man can either run from or sit down with, and since running does not flatter me I sat. We were quiet, and the dog settled with a sigh like a judge who dates optimism out of habit, and I reached for the matchbook we keep for birthday candles, and I set it on the table as a vote, and the letter on top of my stack mentioned the matchbook by color and by brand and said that I would set it down and not strike it, and the part of me that hates obedience decided to light a match anyway, and the sulfur lifted that black mood into the air and then went out on the first flick because of course it did, and I laughed like a man who finds the punchline in his pocket. I told her that I would not be written and that we would not be written, and she nodded and pointed out that a story can be stolen or shared, and that maybe we should stop treating the pages like instructions and start treating them like weather reports, and I liked that because weather can be wrong and you can still carry an umbrella and go where you planned. We packed the letters with a care that had nothing to do with reverence and everything to do with stewardship, and we returned each stack to its box and set both boxes side by side on the top shelf of the pantry because something about storing them near the pasta and the beans made the world feel less enchanted and more domestic, and I said that if magic wants to live here it can learn to reach the same shelf every other need learns to reach. I went to bed tired in the way you get tired when someone keeps rearranging your past with clean paper and firm handwriting, and I lay awake and counted the soft sounds a house makes when it edits itself for the night, and I felt her turn and I turned too, and we met in the middle like two pages that have decided to share a staple, and I thought about my sticky note with its brave little rules, and I understood that rules are less about control and more about keeping your hands busy while you build a raft, and I promised myself that tomorrow I would look for anyone who had lived here before and for any story about boxes and letters and maybe a woman named by those pages, and if the world wanted to join the search it could. Morning arrived with a decent handshake and a narrow smile, and I decided that if reality insists on performing parlor tricks then, I should at least check the wires and the trapdoors, and I drove to the county building where records sit in cabinets like old soldiers, and I asked for the file on our address with the polite firmness of a man who knows that paper loves formality, and the clerk brought me a stack bound with a rubber band that looked older than me, and I stood at a tall desk and read the line of deeds and taxes and small permits, and I traced the names back through owners and inheritances, and one name repeated like a drum, and the name belonged to a couple who kept the house through 3 decades and who added the attic hatch in a year that explains the way it sticks, and there was a permit for a dormer that never got built and a note that the original owner favored cedar because it did not complain, and there in the margin someone had drawn a tiny box with a loop of thread. And I am aware that people write doodles on everything, yet my hands cooled, as if someone had opened a door behind me, and I turned and saw only the lazy air of a public office doing its job. I copied their names and I walked to the library because libraries still believe in answers, and the librarian found a newspaper page that mentioned the couple and an anniversary and a photograph where the wife held a stack of envelopes tied in a ribbon, and the caption joked about how she never forgot birthdays, and I looked at the grin on the husband's face and I felt the strange pinch that arrives when you recognize a gesture that should not be yours in a stranger who lived before you were tall enough to reach a counter. On the way home, I stopped at the hardware store for no good reason other than it smells like work, and I asked the owner whether he knew anything about our place because he looks like the kind of man houses gossip to, and he scratched his jaw and told me he had never been in our attic, but he had delivered paint to the couple in that photograph years back, and the wife had joked that the house writes things when it gets bored, and he had laughed the way we laugh when we want to belong to the joke. But no, we are outside of it, and then he rang me up for a pack of screws that I did not need and told me to watch for nails in the alley because the last storm had made the fence mean. I drove home feeling like a detective who keeps finding postcards instead of suspects, and while I drove I thought about the way our 2 boxes sat in the pantry between the pasta and the beans, and I liked that image because every haunting benefits from being shelved near the food that keeps a family honest. She was on a call when I came in, and she made the universal finger sign that means I will be 2 minutes, and I set my receipts in a pile and fed the dog a half biscuit as payment for not judging me, and I opened the pantry and lifted both boxes down and listened because I have started to think that letters make a sound long before you read them, and I untied the blue thread and the red thread, and I placed one stack on the left and the other on the right like a scale, and in the middle I placed a blank page because I wanted to ask my invisible correspondent a plain favor without past tense or future predictions sitting on my shoulder, and I wrote a request that felt like a dare, and I kept the hand steady and the words neat, and I asked whoever listens to return something small that I once lost in this house and that I still miss, and I did not name it because naming spells can feel greedy, and I folded the page and slipped it between the 2 stacks as if introducing friends who share a hobby. I tied both threads and I put the boxes back, and I made no flower lines and no tape traps because sometimes an experiment needs to know it is trusted, and I poured iced tea and sat with my notebook and listed the places inside our house where small things vanish, and the dog watched with the fixed interest he reserves for any activity that might involve snacks, and I laughed because somewhere there is a letter that records this laugh and the time of day and the color of the glass I held. She finished her call and joined me at the table, and I told her about the clerk and the photograph and the ribbon of envelopes, and she nodded like a person hearing about an old relative, and she told me that a woman from down the block had texted to offer us a set of shelves if we can pick them up because they do not fit her new apartment, and she said the woman mentioned that our house was known for good stories, and I said that is what you get when walls collect drafts, and we both smiled because if you cannot smile while you wait for the floor to shift, then you should not live above dirt. We put on shoes and walked down to the silver house with the lopsided porch, and the woman greeted us with a crate of books and said the shelves were ready to go, and while we moved the pieces through her doorway she asked how the attic was treating us, and she said it the way people ask about a mutual friend, and I told her it was hot and full of insulation and one other thing, and she nodded like she had been waiting for me to say that phrase, and she told us the old couple kept a little ceremony where they wrote letters when they could not say the thing out loud, and then they hid the letters in places the house would find them, and the house would move the words around until both of them could handle the truth, and she laughed as if she expected us to laugh too, and added that the old couple stayed married to the end and died the same summer, and that there were worse maps for a marriage, and I agreed because we were both carrying a shelf and it would have been rude to drop it over. Philosophy. Back home she measured the wall and I held the level, and we hung those shelves with the practiced patience that 1,000 weekends have given us, and when we were done the dog did the formal inspection that ends every project in our house and declared the work acceptable by closing his eyes and sighing, and we unpacked the crate of books, and they were the kind of mix a neighborhood yields with cookbooks and mysteries and old textbooks and a thin diary with no lock and a plain cover, and I almost Did not open it because you should not read a stranger's diary, and then the weight of our boxes made that rule feel quaint, and I opened it and found pages with tiny neat lines and entries from years ago that listed weather and groceries and a few stray prayers that were practical and stubborn, and on one page there was a note about the winking cow billboard and a complaint about poor pie and a small drawing of an envelope tied with ribbon, and I felt my scalp crawl the way it does when an idea steps into the room wearing your jacket. I showed the page to her, and we both stood there like people who have been called by name from a great distance, and then we put the diary on the shelf as if it had always belonged there, and maybe it had. I told her about the blank page I had offered between the stacks, and she did not scold because our new policy does not punish curiosity unless it breaks the dog or the dishes, and she took my hand and said that maybe we should ask for something we both lost, and we said the word together, and that word was mornings, and by that we meant the way we used to sit with coffee and talk before the day started driving, and the way we used to share tiny plans as if they were pearls and not just lists, and we did not write that sentence because it felt like enough to say it and to admit that we missed something that can be built by two people who live in the same building and bring each other spoons. We cooked dinner slow, and we did not turn on the television, and we ate at the table where the boxes had been, and we told each other the boring details that make up real intimacy, and we let the dog lick a plate because forgiveness starts with small gestures, and the house hummed in the agreeable key that tells me we are not making it angry. Later that night, a small thing returned itself with the mild triumph of a cat, and I found it on the office bookshelf where I had looked a dozen times, and it was the brass cap from a pen that my father had given me when I got promoted, and I had lost the cap a year ago and kept the pen in a drawer out of embarrassment because I felt like a man who breaks heirlooms by thinking near them, and now the cap sat with a smug shine between two books, and it clicked onto the pen with a satisfaction that reached a tender place I had not visited since last spring, and I carried it to her, and she smiled the private smile she saves for good repairs, and she said the house keeps its bargains when you ask nicely, and I told her not to become superstitious because I like to pretend I am the rational backbone of this operation, and she said I was safe because the backbone never sees the hand that writes, and we both laughed because that sounded like poetry that had found a wrench. We decided to try a bigger test, and it was her idea, which means it was smarter and riskier, and she said, what if we write letters that confess things we have not done and do not plan to do, and see whether the boxes promote fantasy into memory or if they leave imagination where it belongs, which is on the porch where it can look through the window but not rearrange the furniture, and I agreed because control sometimes wears the clothes of surrender, and we sat down with fresh paper and we wrote to each other about a fight we had not had, and about a trip we had not taken, and about a kindness we had not given, and we sealed each letter, and we did not read each other's because magic deserves the same privacy you give to passwords, and we nested the envelopes into the pantry boxes like small animals ready for winter, and then we cleaned the kitchen because you always have to clean the kitchen no matter what else happens to your soul that day. In the morning the house delivered its answer in the bland rhythm of errands and time, and we did not fight and we did not travel, and yet the kindness we had written appeared in our hands like a tool we had always owned, and at lunch she reached into her bag and produced a little package, and inside was a watch band I had wanted but never mentioned, and she said she had seen it online a month ago and meant to order it and forgot and then remembered last night and clicked, and my phone pinged with a receipt at the same time because the letter I had written promised her a small gift with no reason, and I had woken early and bought the tea she likes and set it on the stove with a note that used nothing fancy and somehow hit the right target, and we both stood in the kitchen with a watch band and a tin of tea and the dog watching with interest, and we understood that some predictions are not prophetic, they are simply permissions to act like the people we say we want to be. I took the pen with its returned cap and wrote another letter, and this one was not to her and not to me and not to the woman I supposedly write to in my secret other life, and I addressed it to the author of our marriage, and I said that if they intend to keep writing then they need to sign their name because anonymous help feels like a polite robbery, and I asked for one clean truth that would not hurt us more than it helped us, and I tucked the letter into my box and I closed the pantry, and I did not hover and I did not tape, and I went outside and pulled weeds with a hunger that surprised me, and I threw them into the bin like bad habits, and I felt sweat on my neck and the sun on my back, and I thought about permanence again, and I liked the new thought better because it included maintenance and forgiveness and the awareness that a neat kitchen does not guarantee a neat life, but it does help. When I returned to the pantry there was a single page on top of my stack, and it carried my name and hers and the name of the street where the winking cow lives, and it told the simple story of a young couple who moved into this house with a cheap mattress and a good coffee grinder and a promise to use paper when words fail, and it said that the practice saved them more times than pride would admit, and it said that the house kept the drafts because someone should remember the work, and it said that an author is only a title you earn when you keep writing after the middle gets messy and the ending refuses to sit still, and then there was a final line that told me to open the attic again with both of us present and to bring the dog because he understands gratitude, and I read that line twice and felt both the old fear and the new resolve step onto the same stair. We waited until dusk because dusk forgives, and then we gathered our props like patient stagehands, and that meant the blue thread box and the red thread box and the pen with its brass cap back where it belongs and a faithful flashlight and a small bowl of water for the dog because the attic does not consider hydration part of its job, and together we climbed the ladder while the house held its breath and the dog went first with the kind of solemn focus that made me believe the last letter about him had not been flattery. The heat had bled off and the boards offered their usual complaints, and the bulb drew a pale ring on dust and old nails, and the boxes looked smaller in that thin light, which is a trick addicts play to make you underestimate what you carry. We set both boxes between the joists, and the dog walked a slow circle and pressed his nose to a plank near the hatch and tapped it once with his paw, and then looked at me with the look that says pay attention, and I obliged because he understands gratitude and because I have learned to follow honest noses when a story insists on being found. I levered the plank up with a flat bar while she held the flashlight, and the board gave way with a patient sigh, and below it sat a shallow cradle lined with cedar that smelled like responsible people, and there in the cradle lay a thin writing slab with 2 carved grooves, and a slender braid of thread that began blue and red and met in the middle to become a single pale line like a promise that had gone gray without failing, and on top of the slab rested one envelope that had been opened long ago, and tucked back like a message waiting for a new mouth. We did not touch it for a count that felt ceremonial, and then she lifted it with both hands, and I saw how the handwriting shifted along the page as if 2 voices had taken turns in the same body, and the words spoke of a house that keeps drafts because people toss their hardest sentences when the moment passes, and the words spoke of a practice that had saved a marriage twice and nearly broke it once when pride mistook silence for strength, and the words asked the current keepers to write one letter together when the attic felt honest, and to place it on the slab, and to lay a hand on the braided thread, and to let the house decide which pages matter and which pages can return to pulp. We wrote because the instructions sounded like common sense in a uniform that happens to have ribbons, and I pulled the pen with the cap that had returned, and we steadied the paper on the slab, and we did not whisper because secrecy has done enough mischief here, and we named the stupid hurts that had stacked into a wall, and we named the small mercies that had kept us from knocking the wall down with a sledge, and we admitted the cheap tricks we use when we are tired and how those tricks make sleep worse, and we promised mornings again, and we promised to correct ourselves without keeping score, and we promised that if the boxes ever opened their mouths without invitation we would answer together or not at all, and then we signed with the messy gravity of people who know that signatures do not make magic and that effort will have to do the heavy lifting. We set the page upon the slab, and we lowered both hands to the braid, and it warmed like sun on an old porch, and it slackened and slipped through our fingers and fell into the cedar cradle, as if a knot had learned breathing, and the attic air changed in that tiny way a room changes when a door opens elsewhere in the house, and the dog curled up and went to sleep with that theatrical groan he reserves for peace. We closed the cradle and slid the plank back into its old bed, and I pressed the board down with both palms the way you press a story shut when you finally understand the point, and we lifted the boxes and climbed down, and the hallway looked familiar and generous, and the clock in the kitchen claimed a reasonable hour, and I felt the kind of weariness that feels like earned quiet rather than collapse. We set both boxes on the pantry counter because ritual matters, and we untied the blue thread and the red thread, and the stacks behaved like normal paper for the first time in days, and no new page rose to greet us, and no invisible hand nudged anything into place, and I felt a little pang that told me how quickly a person can become addicted to prophecy, and then I felt the better thing that told me I did not want a life outfitted by drafts from a hidden editor, and we set both stacks back and left the threads curled like old ribbons, and shut the door and turned off the light and stood still like people do after combing a beach and finding enough. Morning returned with a cleaner face, and the grinder spoke its stubborn vows, and she bumped my hip because that is how mornings introduce themselves in our kitchen, and the dog performed his touring production of What If a Bowl Could Be Filled, and we talked before the news and before email and before the day pulled on its boots, and we told each other trivial plans as if they were pearls again, and it felt odd because new habits always feel like costumes for a scene you hope to inhabit, and we kept going until the coffee gave up its last heat and the sun landed on the table like a friendly coin, and I felt something that I would not call permanence because I have retired that word, and I would not call certainty because that word does not trust anyone, and I settled on steadiness because steadiness does not mind the work that keeps it alive. I took the pen and the returned cap, and I opened a fresh page, and I wrote to the house because a thank you will not hurt, and I thanked it for holding our drafts, and I told it that we would handle most of the edits ourselves, and I slid that note into the pantry without ceremony and closed the door and went back to the sink and rinsed the grinder because a small task done well can keep a big vow upright, and when I turned I saw a single thin page on the counter where no page had been, and I did not rush to it like a kid to a present because I have learned to let part of me want and part of me wait, and then I lifted it and found one line in my own hand that I do not remember writing, and the line said, "This is not a script, this is a cue," and I stood there with the page and the smell of coffee and the morning figuring itself out, and I believed that line the way you believe the weight of a door you have hung yourself I tucked the page under the magnet with the dog photo, and she saw it and smiled the quiet smile for a good repair, and we started the day with our new rule that is old in its bones, and the house hummed in that agreeable key again as if someone had tuned it. We still keep both boxes on the top pantry shelf, and we still use paper when our mouths forget their job, and some nights we open the attic for no reason other than to let the air remind us that stories live above our heads and below our floors whether we read them or not, and I still think about the winking cow when I pass billboards because I like being reminded that a joke once saved me from believing a lie about myself and about the woman beside me. The town is still there, and the pie is still better in memory, and the hawk still circles where it wants, and I still fix doors and thermostats, and I still say that the world can be turned off and on, and also that sometimes it will not, and that is when you fetch thread and write your way to a decent day. We did not burn the boxes because fire never needed our help, and I do not tape the hatch because trust should not always wear a badge, and we do not wait for letters to tell us who to be because we have learned the lesson that the old couple carved into the cedar by use rather than by knife, and the lesson goes like this, and I say it to myself when the kitchen is quiet and the grinder is drying on a towel. Love is simple only when you keep it small. Love gets better when you treat it like maintenance. Write when your mouth fails. Speak when the paper gets lazy. Keep the dog watered. Keep the coffee honest. Keep your hands on the verbs.